So my name's Rachel Griffiths. I'm an academic developer at Exeter working on our inclusive education project. I'm a former DSA funded specialist autism and mental health mentor. And because it's relevant to the way that I approached this master's project, I'm also in the very long process of getting a formal autism diagnosis. And I was also helping my mum move house recently and found a lot of photos of me when I was little in the phase where everyone was asking my mum if I was a boy or not, and remembered all of the masculine names and identities that I tried out in adolescence. So this is a bit of a personal project too. And I have to credit the little icon that will appear throughout my slides to Tom Caro, who works in the EDI team, who helped me put this together for a presentation that I did at the beginning of the year. So yes. Right, why is my slide not moving forward? There we go. So the title for both this presentation and my master's thesis was taken from this quote, which came from one of my participants. Sometimes it's like you've given them a bomb full of bees. They don't want the bomb, nor do they want their house full of bees, but you've given them both, and then they just have to deal with it. And you're like, oh God, I'm so sorry I've given you a bomb full of bees. And they're like, I'm not allowed to hate you for giving me a bomb full of bees. I'll just resent you for it instead. And I think that says so much about the inner world of somebody with two highly stigmatized identities. And I'll go into that in a little bit more as it comes on. So the research problem that I was looking at, and I'm very into Lego teaching at the moment, so there's a definite theme in the images here. They make sense to me, but you know, you can interpret them how you wish. This is the problem I looked at. We know that autism and gender fluidity often go hand in hand, and that managing those identities separately involve complicated coming out conversations and identity management strategies. Researchers focus quite a lot on masking, for example. Both autistic and trans students face being othered at university and find it hard to establish a sense of belonging. And I just wanted to say a little bit about trans terminology here. So I've taken the asterisk following one trans researcher, Nicolazzo, who uses it like a Boolean search term. So it means that the word trans here is used in its broadest sense to encompass all those whose gender is different to that which they were assigned at birth in all its fluid forms. However, the literature here has some significant holes in it. So it's predominantly neuronormative and cisnormative. Both autism and transness are seen as a disorder. There's very much a strong focus on prevalence data for gender nonconformity in autistic people and the etiology of it. So lots of thinking about why and less so what. There's very little published research on lived experience, very little published research on differentiated autistic belongingness at all, in fact. And there's nothing really looking at that autistic trans intersection in higher education. And when I was mentoring a lot of students, I found that it came up an awful lot in conversations, which is why I started thinking about, you know, isn't it interesting? Research on autistic masking doesn't look at the impact of trans passing, but there's a huge field of autistic writing talking about what it's like to live as an autistic trans person. And I was very concerned that literature reviews don't really include that autobiographical writing. So I wanted to sort of purposely include all of that rich sort of source of autistic writing and not just those published research papers. So this is what I found. There's some literature on trans belongingness. There's a little bit about autistic queerness, bit about autistic belongingness, but that sort of intersection in the middle, there's a big gap, which is what I wanted to work with some students and have a think about. So the research aims were to explore how autistic trans students manage their identities and find a sense of belonging at university. I wanted to use interpretive phenomenological methodology, which is just a very long-winded way of saying it's getting at sort of the inner world lived experience bit to guide some tentative suggestions for improvements to university support. I wanted to add to the fields of research on both autistic gender identity and autistic belongingness, focusing on that lived experience bit, and to amplify that autistic writing and autobiography by carrying out robust research that would back that up. And I really wanted to do this co-created participatory research bit. I think it's the only way to do ethical research, as I'll say a little bit more about later. So that's what I was aiming at. These are the questions I asked. In what ways do autistic trans students manage their identities and find a sense of belonging at university? What's the place of higher education institutions in shaping that identity? And how can we in higher education and the institutions that we work within better support the needs of autistic trans students? Little bit about methodology, IPA, so qualitative, in-depth, that meaning making in action. So me as a researcher observing and joining in with participants, making meaning for themselves, me reflecting on that process, and together that sort of holistic and hermeneutic cycle of watching meaning making in action. It was participatory and evolving process. The 3 participants who all happened to have autistic diagnoses, but it wasn't required. There were 2 trans men and 1 non-binary transmasculine student. And the first phase that that took place was a survey to sort of do some demographic stuff, and for people to come forward with ideas for a loose topic guide for an interview. And then I held those interviews on topics, but it was very much an evolving process. So we had ideas for topic guides, we sort of formulated some questions, but I very, very much went where the students I was interviewing led. And then we kept reflecting on the process as we went through. So at each stage, the participants shared their ideas with me, they read my interpretations, they gave me some feedback. We had a couple of additional meetings where they told me I'd got it wrong, and we looked again at what we thought, and sort of all of that process was something that we all did together. And actually the participants gave me some lovely feedback at the end about what it was like to do that process and to feel in control of this, which was really important. You know, it was the first time certainly that 2 of them had ever discussed any of this with anybody else, really outside their close friendship circle. And it was quite significant for them. So it felt a respectful way to do it. And this was the bit that, you know, some of you might be familiar with already, but I came across Nick Walker's work on neuroqueering, and it was kind of revolutionary to the way that I framed the project. That process of subverting and liberating the self from both neuronormativity and heteronormativity simultaneously. And this book is fantastic. I would very much recommend that you read any of Nick's work and listen to the work that that she's done on some autism research sites. Chloe, whose surname has now escaped me, but I'm sure that Samaya will be able to find links and things, and we can put those up afterwards. But yeah, Nick is a terrific advocate and agitator on this area, which is really important. So the participants and I created this way of thinking about autistic trans belonging at university, and we realised that it embodied itself an act of transing. So transformation, seeing university as a crucible and a safe bubble for identity creation. Thinking about transience, where belonging is fragile and nebulous and mercurial, so it never really stays the same. Sometimes you feel like you belong and sometimes you don't, and it was very much in the moment with whatever was going on around you. Transition, a lot there about working out how to embody masculinity, and I'm aware obviously all the participants that I was working with were going through that process rather than transing towards femininity. Transaction, so lots about being in relationship with others, and transgression, what it is to transgress norms, and this idea of being uncanny, something about you that people can't quite get a handle on, and other. And this is what it looked like, because we like a pretty picture. So all of these different transings as a way of embodying that identity management and belongingness. And I'll go through each of those. So transgression. Transgression was all about transgressing student norms, intragroup norms, societal norms, and bodily norms. Yeah, this thing that you can't quite put your finger on it, but people intuit that it's different and transgressive. And a lot of what students were saying was about seeing themselves as a burdensome other, and often preemptively taking the self away, not giving other people the opportunity to be burdened with your presence, be that not turning up to lectures, not going out with people, declining invitations, looking after other people by doing the taking away yourself. What came across, and it's there in the quote, is that this is one stigmatized identity too many. If you are autistic, most people can find a way of relating to you at some level. If you are trans, again, people can find a way of relating to you at some level. To be both is just too much for others to bear, was what students were saying. Yet there's this strong sense of belongingness through a shared struggle to raise these systemic barriers and inequalities. By finding those communities of social justice was a way that a lot of the students found that sense of belongingness. Transience. And this idea that belongingness is a shifting state, so predicated on feeling safe in the immediate surroundings and with others. And I think this sort of pile of heads sort of reminds me of what the students were saying, but it's the ability to pass correctly in a gender that is what was associated for these students with feeling safe. Constant self-monitoring, checking for masking and passing. Am I walking correctly? Am I looking fine? Am I speaking appropriately? Have I got my tics under control? All of these things were really enmeshed with the idea of feeling safe. And this goes beyond a feeling that you're masking in order to fit in and feel socially accepted. For these students, this was about a physical safety. And that not passing correctly, either in your gender or in your sort of autistic self, was associated with being in danger. But there was that awful feeling that that ability to pass well is something completely outside your control. And often for a lot of students, they were crediting biological fortune with their ability to feel safe and therefore belong. This was something that actually you couldn't just fix by dressing differently. You know, people, one of the students was saying actually that they were very privileged to be tall and have quite a deep voice just without needing to do anything else. And that was seen as something that was directly associated with their feelings of belongingness. Stigma was keenly felt, but it couldn't quite be touched. There was something that just kept slipping through your fingers. You couldn't quite say what it was that left you feeling that you were other. And it was very, very difficult to call it out, particularly in dynamics with housemates. Transition. So each of the participants I was speaking to was negotiating the transition to an embodied masculinity. And there was a really interesting dynamic that we spent quite a lot of time in getting right. Me and my interpretations of what I was seeing in the data, and the students in their keenness to tell me when I'd got it wrong and what the right interpretation was. And this was about transitioning to masculinity, which meant transitioning towards belonging to a group that represents power and fear. And it's capable of abuse, and it's representative of an unearned privilege that all of my participants who had grown up female and in that sort of feminine gendered norm, but that it feels fantastic to pass as male and to be seen as male. And how both of those things are something to be wrestled with. Both feeling great to be recognized as male, but also incredibly uncomfortable that this means actually belonging to, a body of unearned power and privilege. But we were thinking a little bit about actually how great this is for allyship, and that what these autistic trans individuals are able to say for all of us in this fight against gender violence, what this perspective about having lived in different genders has to say about these struggles, which was a really interesting thing that came out of the research that I was very unprepared for. Transaction. So finding belonging meant being in relationship with others. And again, this is against this myth of autistic aloneness. But developing these relationships involved comprehensive testing the trustworthiness of others, weighing up the pros and cons. Is this worth it? Is this worth all the pain and the disclosure that I need to go to get close enough to this person to feel like we can meet somewhere in the middle? And there was this constant searching for an unconditional acceptance. Putting in the hard work, it was described by one of the participants as, you need to know that you need to put in serious legwork to get to know me, and that not everyone is prepared to put this in. But it doesn't need to be another neurodivergent or a trans person. There's lots of research out there saying that actually this neurodivergent or autistic to autistic communication is the only way to communicate effectively. But actually, for these particular students, that shared experience of being outside societal norms seems to be the key in that relationship formation. So again, that might be something very, very specific to autistic trans students, but it's not just about having a neurodivergence in common. And the last bit is about transformation. Universities are potentially places for transformative identity development and self-discovery. And one of the students described it as this crucible. You chuck everything into the pot and you're really put through the ringer. A crucible in its true sense, but out of that can come something amazing. That there's something about this environment where you can simultaneously find structures and rules that work for you. You have the opportunity to make a fresh start and turn your back on all of those childhood ways of being, all those childhood friendships who saw you in one way that you may have developed out of. You can meet role models, you can be part of meaningful relationships, you can be oneself in university and another self at home. That actually was seen as incredibly helpful to this identity development process. But engaging with it, that transformational opportunity, is extremely costly, and all of the students expressed how exhausting the process of doing this work actually was, on top of all the usual stuff that you need to do as a student. So this huge sort of emotional energy that you put into working out who you are, living as a different self, trying things out perhaps. So thinking about what all of it means. For autistic trans students, this research showed that actually safety was a prerequisite of belongingness. So if you're thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, these students need that bottom tier of safety needs met before anything else can take place, before useful transition, useful induction activities, certainly sort of getting to know your peers before you get into any of the academic structures of university that we're so desperately trying to get students to hit the ground running at, getting used to your lectures and where you're going, and here's your online forum and your platform, all this kind of stuff. Actually, there are a cohort of students who, if you bypass their safety needs, will never feel like they belong in university. That there's a huge interrelationship between autistic masking and trans passing, how those both get in each other's way, but also how those lifelong skills of autistic masking contribute to your skills to pass as a trans student. that measures of belongingness in higher education need to be adapted for the experience of stigmatized groups. We're very good at saying what belongingness looks like. Advanced HE does it all the time, but it only talks about what belongingness means for a certain group of students. And it doesn't look at what belongingness means for a different group of students, particularly those who are highly stigmatized. And that's where I'm going to sort of come on to do some more research after this. Autistic transmasculinity has so much to tell us. And if we think about it in terms of this autistic art of failure, and if I were to sort of recommend anything to read, this Jackson Perry article would be it, because it's about reframing the boundaries of what we consider to be success and failure. And actually, if we expand the way that we look at those people, those characteristics, those measures that we see as failing, we can actually see it as incredibly generative and creative, which can contribute to a rich way of seeing ourselves, and particularly gender in this context. And I think we've looked here in this group before about whether universities are truly inclusive or actually benevolent gatekeepers, because we do like to see ourselves as this sort of we welcome everybody, but we welcome everybody often feels like, but not you. And these co-created models of inclusion that include the voices of those people at intersections is really, really important. And I don't think we've yet worked out how to get at those people, us, who sit at various intersections. We do tend to still see people as sort of inclusion groups who don't actually belong and move fluidly and sort of trans in and out of each other, which is again something that we need to think about in research and address in higher education. I love this. I don't know what it is about this little Lego image, but it just really, it speaks to what I think about the process, that there is one person who's kind of driving the bike, because there's got to be somebody who puts their name in, when you're part of a taught course, on the thing, on the master's dissertation, on the PhD thing, but it's a collaborative process. And actually, for me, it was really important to share my identity with the students. There will be an awful lot of views in this room. There are a huge amount of views in academia about whether that's okay or not. My personal view that for this project, it was really important to share my identity with the participants, to meet halfway about making myself vulnerable with them, because I was expecting it of them. And that was, you know, a significant part of the process. To make mistakes, I made loads, and being able to say, actually, I don't know if I've got this right. How does it sound? What do you think? Is this the right word? I think is a really important part of any research process, and paying real attention to those communication preferences. One of the participants was very open about the fact, once we'd just sort of had a discussion about it, that actually email didn't work for him at all, that they would just disappear off into the ether. So I just agreed to text him whenever we had an appointment coming up or whenever there was a meeting. And that was the way that we did stuff. And that was fine. But I think that you need to, one needs to, not pay lip service to communication preferences. They are hugely significant in research. And that if somebody is going to need a personal text to say, don't forget we're meeting in half an hour, that's what it takes. So in my view, ethical research goes beyond the sort of the bearer list that we're all familiar with. I think it has to be led by community priorities. I am of the view that research must answer questions that the community asks. In my view, it's participatory. This worthwhile bit. I couldn't pay the participants, but they've helped me with some training, they've written some of this. I will always credit them in the process. And if I write any papers, they will be co-authors with me if they want to be. But it drives change. Something happens as a result of the piece of research that you've done. It doesn't just sit on a shelf. One of the participants said to me afterwards that the thing that he wanted people to take away from this research was that it lived, which is part of the reason I'm doing this, that you talk about it, that people understand that it's meaningful, that something changes as a result. Otherwise, it's a waste of researchers' time, and more importantly, it's a waste of the participants' time. And a little bit of a think about what next. I have been very fortunate. I've just found out I've got some ESRC studentship to do the PhD at the School of Education in Exeter to look at this, which is fantastic. And what I'm going to look at is something that came out of a bit of a tangent of this, but there was a concept of autistic shame, and I'd like to think of it more broadly in terms of neurodivergent shame. This idea that there is a long bag of educational trauma that neurodivergence learners come into higher education with, of all of those years of being different and stigmatized and having to learn separate to their peers, at the end of the corridor with the 83-year-old lady who comes in to listen to separate people doing their reading, where you're told you need to sit still and not talk like that and not talk over people. All of those messages that you pick up, and that's without the overt being othered, come with you into higher education. And I think university can either be places of that positive transformation, or they can perpetuate that trauma and turn out a cohort of learners who will never go near lifelong learning again, which I think would be an awful outcome from higher education. I'd like to move neurodivergence away from just autism and ADHD. I think we're very good at involving the voices of the right kind of neurodivergence in research. And actually, I think we need to try a bit harder at including more people within that. So in its broadest sense, so I'm working quite closely and collaborating with Tourette's Action, and looking next at thinking about people, particularly mature learners who may be epileptic or have acquired brain injury, a much broader field of people who can look at what it is to belong as a neurodivergent person. And neurodivergent research collectives, of which this is one. But I think there is enormous power in neurodivergent researchers coming together, and there are lots of lovely pockets of it around the country. And I think it's a fantastic way of developing research, and also helping, other neurodivergent researchers realize that actually there is no bad way or wrong way of doing research if you follow those ethical principles, that you might not do things the traditional normative academic way, but it's not to say that it's less good. So that's where next. There's a load of research references on there for when you see the slides, and these three bits of reading, which are all written by autistic trans people, are fantastic reads. There are some collections of essays there, and Dale's book is a real sort of autobiography of their life. So yes, I would highly recommend those. And that's it. I will end there.